Very good evening, dear participants. A warm welcome to one and all of you. Thank you indeed for sparing precious time to participate in NHRDN Mind Matters Initiative. As you would know, this is entirely focusing on promoting mental health awareness within not just our workspaces, but in society in general. This is a glimpse of all the organizations that have partnered or come on board with us as part of this initiative, a total of 111 organizations to be precise. So gratitude to each of you who have pledged your allegiance to this very valuable and noble cause. Here is what we have been providing organizations with in terms of support with their mental health policy and their entire journey of increasing awareness on this front. Communication kits for the management to use, a framework for, again, the organization to clarify on roles when it comes to mental health awareness, an entire repository of information, including employee assistance programs and helplines, along with free LinkedIn courses on mental health, which are available during the Mind Matters week and beyond. Conditions apply. We will share details in the subsequent slide. And this morning, we have successfully completed the Mind Matters Ambassador certification. We had 100 plus participants, and we're very confident that with support of each of these team members, we will be able to spread the word not just in your organizations, but in the work scenario overall. As mentioned earlier, these are the courses that are available. LinkedIn has been gracious to extend these to anyone who is keen on the NHRDN Mind Matters initiative. It is open for others as well, over and above the organizations that have signed up. So do let us know in case you are keen on going through any of these courses. There are a few more which we will post on the website. So do tune into the NHRDN website for details on this. These are the various sessions that we have planned as part of this entire week. As we speak, we have completed more than five actually, 7 or 8 sessions. This particular session, as you will see, is on substance use in the workplace. And before we start off with the session, a few of these ground rules that we would request you to adhere to. Your lines will be kept on mute to ensure that there isn't any disturbance during the session. In case you have a question, please feel free to use the questions box or raise your hand using the button here, and we will either unmute your line or take your questions towards the end of the session, depending on how much time we have at hand. There will be a feedback form that we will share with you. Do ensure that you fill that in. We rely on inputs from you to ensure that we are able to live up to your expectations in terms of our offerings. And most importantly, do spread the word. Again, it is entirely on the participants of this initiative to spread the word and ensure that we are able to create a workspace that is truly inclusive for anyone who may have any concerns to do with mental health. These are details of the session today. And in order to conduct the entire conversation with our speakers for the day, which is Sukanya and Shyam, it is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Geeta Kumar, who is the moderator for today's session. She's the founder and principal consultant at Pragati. This is an organization, a multi-dimensional platform that works with a single purpose to help individuals regain their well-being and remain aligned to their purpose. With over 28 years of work experience as an OD consultant, coach and facilitator, and an HR professional. She holds a master's degree in international management and a PhD in gender studies. In addition, she is a trained process work facilitator, a certified MBTI 5OB practitioner, and a student practitioner of Vedanta. She has expertise in the POSH space, prevention of sexual harassment at the workplace, and she has conducted various workshops on POSH and is part of the external committee, external member in the IC of organizations. She's a senior advisor to a lot of organizations, and she's also senior consultant with Interweave in the Women's Leadership Development Programs vertical. And she's also actively associated with Consumers India as a mentor and core team member. She puts out a lot of white papers, articles, posts, and does a lot of research work on topics pertaining to gender and technology, and enabling women in workplaces, and so on. So a warm welcome to Dr. Geeta Kumar, Sukanya, and Shyam. Over to you, Dr. Kumar.
Thank you, Nisha, for the wonderful start. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Yes, we are able to.
Okay. I'm delighted to be moderating today's session on substance use at the workplace. The previous two sessions had indeed been a very deep dive with some real authentic conversation around suicide, self-harm, gender and sexuality. What came out very clearly is that all these issues around mental health are very interconnected and cannot be viewed in isolation. Even the issues that are coming up in the next few days, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, body image, that will be explored, are actually manifestations of something deeper. Today's session on substance use is also correlated to multiple other mental health issues. So let me quickly begin by setting up the context. Substance use is a topic of interest in the area of health, particularly mental health. This is an area with enormous implications for public health and has generated a substantial amount of research and practice models. And yet, it continues to remain in the periphery of mainstream discussions in everyday lives, including the workplace. It's only when the substance use turns to abuse that it begins to draw attention, and still, unfortunately, only to be treated with an individual's specific symptom-based treatment outlook. What actually constitutes these substances? What are we referring to? Commonly, it is used for usage of alcohol, tobacco, nicotine, recreational and diversion of prescription drugs, as well as illicit substances. But that's really not all. It actually covers even seemingly harmless substances like tea, coffee, and in the current context, technology use and the related behavioral issues surrounding it. Today, we have two wonderful mental health professionals, therapists and counselors who work on this area and are deeply invested and passionate about demystifying and destigmatizing substance use in everyday life. So today's session, we will be in conversation with them to explore a spectrum of dimensions around substance use in the workplace and the individual context. And most importantly, also discuss the impact on families and institutions. We will also be discussing the reasons why the existing models to deal with the issues of substance use are proving to be dysfunctional, and how we need to widen the lens from disease management to a more holistic and healing approach. At the end of the session, we sincerely hope that substance use becomes a topic of active conversation, normalization, and institutionalization. So let me begin by introducing our panelists for today. So Kanya is an assistant professor at TISS and a practicing psychotherapist. She extensively counsels patients with substance use issues. She is a trained trauma therapist and uses cutting-edge therapies. She is also a certified trained addiction expert. Our second panelist for the day, Shyam, is a consultant and assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education. He is skilled in trauma-informed psychological interventions and has developed a special interest in working with emerging adults, the age actually where the journey with substance use usually begins. Shyam also conducts motivational interviewing workshops for professionals working in de-addiction clinics. Welcome, Sukanya and Shyam. Really looking forward to our conversation today and to the active audience participation. Before we begin, I would like to invite all the participants in the audience to keep putting out your questions in the chat. We are also sharing a handout. It's already available in the chat, which is the handout on substance use. It's going to be very useful. And as we are going through the session, you can happily glance through it. And of course, it's a valuable takeaway that addresses most of the areas that we will be discussing today. And let me thank Sukanya and Shyam for putting this together in record time, very, very quickly. And questions, I think all the questions we will decided that we'll take it at the end, because I think a lot will be covered during the session, and we will address whatever has been missed out. So let me begin with requesting Sukanya to take us through understanding what substance use really means, what it entails, some recent data around it, and when does it move from use to abuse or addiction. So over to you, Sukanya.
Thank you, Geeta, and thank you to NHRD and Mind Matters for this initiative. I think, like you mentioned, that it's a very pertinent topic in today's world, especially in the workplace, and not just something that can be viewed anymore as a disease. And I think you already brought that point out, that looking at the sheer continuum of substances, starting from the innocuous tea, coffee, to moving on to illicit substances, the continuum is such that it is worrying, and the sheer availability and the recent statistics around how much of these substances are being used by Indians makes this topic very, very relevant. So let me begin with answering your first question: what do we mean by substance use? Although we really look at addiction as being a kind of chemical addiction, meaning that we need a substance which has chemical effects on our brain, which is really interacting with the neurotransmitters in our brain. But when we think of addiction as an issue as such, we do want to include other substances which may not be as inherently harmful for the brain. They may be as innocuous as caffeine or stuff like that. We also want to include the dialogue on behavioral addiction, which is something I think Shyam will talk in a while. Behavioral addictions would also include substances like food and other behaviors like internet usage, sex addiction, and even shopping addiction, which are all behaviors, as you can guess, Geeta, that these are all things that we all do most of the time. And how many times have we really logged on to our Amazon apps in the last few months to shop something because we were feeling so bored by the pandemic as well. So when we look at the issue of substance use, I think we are looking at this entire continuum of substances and behaviors, which offers a kind of relief to a mental state which seems to be a little disturbing, which seems to be unpleasant. So in all senses, addiction, if you want to define it, can be defined as a means of over depending on something else, and as an unhealthy dependence that comes up in the context of not being okay with some parts of our lives. And I don't want to call that a mental health issue outright, because that's what really gives addiction that disease model, which it is not. And we had that disease model right from 1960, when Jelinek introduced his concept of alcoholism in his book, The Concept of Alcoholism, which gave the idea of disease to alcoholism. And since then, we have had this worrying trend of pathologizing addiction. So any kind of use of these substances, any kind of use of alcohol or cannabis or tobacco or anything as such, or these kind of behavioral addictions we are looking at now, we tend to look at it from that lens of addiction. But we all know that just using something, using the substance or engaging in a particular behavior is not enough to call it an addiction. It is only that over dependence, when it sets in, that it can qualify for being an addiction. So when we look at current statistics, and there are a couple of very recent statistics which are available, conducted by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment and the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India, which shows the current burden of addiction, and some of it is already covered in the handout, so the audience can also take a look at the information there. The 2019 survey by the NDDTC AIMS Delhi, which was part of the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment initiative to look at substance use, found that there's almost 16 crore people of the population who use alcohol. Out of that 16 crore, we have 19% who qualify for dependence. And apart from alcohol, the other substances which have been found to be rampant in use is tobacco, which is much, much more than alcohol in terms of use, also cannabis and opioid. In fact, the use of opioids has gone up from 2 million to 22 million. And along with that, the treatment gap that exists, the treatment gap meaning that people who actually are able to seek treatment and the people who have these kind of issues of substance use, that treatment gap seems to be almost at 75%. What we see are really stark figures, and it sort of outlines that the current legal frameworks, the NDPS Act, and the other supporting frameworks which are trying to control this burden of addiction is not perhaps enough. We are probably not looking at the right model of addiction. Addiction, like I said, the disease model of addiction which Jelinek introduced in 1960 has now been refuted because it's not enough, and it is extremely destigmatizing to call it a disease and to look at people who are using substances to cope with some parts of their life as extremely stigmatizing and marginalizing for them. It does not empower us to know that we are dependent or over-dependent on something, and it does not lead to change behavior. Nor is addiction a choice, which is another model of addiction which used to be looked at. Addiction as a choice brings the individual under the lens and completely attributes the causes of addiction to the individual, to their character being flawed or not having enough of willpower, and that's, needless to say, not empowering at all, and in fact extremely stigmatizing, especially in a workplace. And how often have we come across our co-workers feeling extremely stressed out and looking forward to the weekend to just have some alcohol with their friends and to just relax? Would we call that an addiction, or would we call that a responsible or recreational use of alcohol? How many times have we actually seen co-workers going out for a smoke break? And does it pass our mind that anyone who goes out for a smoke break could be addicted to nicotine, or could be just using it as a means of just a release of stress and may not be addicted to it? So that fine line between using a substance for recreational purposes, using it not at a dependence level, and being dependent and over-dependent on a substance or on a behavior has been outlined now. The field of psychiatry has moved ahead from that disease model to looking at use, harmful use and dependence. And there are criteria to actually call the behavior as dependence. So there are certain criteria which highlights the issue of loss of control and the issue of salience, which means that when we do not have control over the substance anymore, intaking the substance anymore, or when we feel that the use of the substance has kind of taken over other areas of our life, it's eating into our finances, or it's eating up significant time from our family time, etc., or even our work time. That's the worrying part, and that's probably what can be looked at as the over dependence aspect. It's important to understand that the harmful use part is, like I said, it's a continuum of risk. So at one hand lies that innocuous cup of coffee in the morning, and we know that that might be something we're looking for just to feel a little woke in the morning. Two, that extremely dependent use of substances on a daily basis, which is eating into our finances, which is leading to loss of control, which is leading to withdrawal symptoms, which is leading to other areas of our lives being affected, that would qualify as dependence. So all of these issues that we're talking of, use, recreational use, harmful use, and core dependence that we're talking about, lies on a continuum. So at one end, we have the recreational use, where we have more control over taking the substance, and the substance itself or the behavior itself not taking charge of our lives, not becoming the salient parts of our lives. to the other extreme when it has become dependence, and it probably requires intervention. I would not call it treatment, because the moment we call it treatment, we are looking at it from the disease model, which is no longer something that is supported by even psychiatry. So it's important to understand this, and probably then being able to understand what is addiction and why and when do we move towards that over dependence.
So Shyam, would you like to add something here?
Right. I think what Suganya said is a very important point for us, each one of us, to understand. Substance dependence is actually the other side of the continuum, and use is in the the extreme opposite side of the continuum. So I think certain things what Suganya pointed out in terms of craving. So I try to help you understand in terms of behavioral addiction. Imagine all of us have smartphones with us. How many times have we thought of taking it even without our awareness, opening it and unlocking it and then just locking it up? And we do that multiple number of times, even if. And imagine you able to keep your phone away in a different room and then walk out of the place. How long can you keep away from your phone? Now, to get a taste of what dependence is or addiction is, this is the same process what a person who's dependent on a substance also goes through. It's very easy for us to actually tell them, if you decide you can leave. Can each one of us decide to leave using our smartphones from today onwards, at least for next one day? It's going to be very difficult. So very important point is compulsion of use. You really feel the urge to use. Craving, compulsion. I'm sure a lot of times you would have decided, I don't want to spend a lot of time on my phone, I will keep it away. I'm just talking about smartphone right now. So there is craving involved. So I really want to use it. And why is it I want to use it? I don't know. So quite often you are disappointed about the fact that you're opening your smartphone and you see nothing is there. So we covered compulsion and craving, and after that there's a consequence. Imagine you are in a household, you're living in a family, a father or a housewife, whoever it is. After coming back home, you really do not want to actually use your phone. You really want to interact with the family members, but you end up being with that. So what's the consequence? The consequence is conflict in the family, not able to spend time with family members. It is actually affecting the socio-occupational functioning. Imagine a person who's dependent on the smartphone coming back to office also. So what happens there? The person really, creativity requires a space where you are incubated with a particular idea. But during that incubation period, you have something, the Facebook or a notification which comes in, and you really are cut off from that. And what takes the precedence or what takes the priority is this particular thing. So it's a behavior. So what is controlling? We see, when we see alcohol dependent, the alcohol take over the person. So who's controlling us now? So we all have what we suppose, I call myself a teetotaler, but after understanding behavior addiction, I don't call myself a teetotaler because I understand I'm addicted. So it's very difficult for each one of us to keep away from. So I told you compulsion, craving, there's a consequence, and very important aspect is control. I do not have control over the behaviors. Quite often we see this, we try to educate people, don't do this, this is wrong. And in fact, before we say that, they know what they're doing is not right. So that is, but irrespective of that, it's very difficult for them to say, but I lack control over my behavior. This is one of the things, one of the situation, what we call dependence situation, where you lack your control over that particular behavior. You can't choose when to do it. In fact, that substance, that behavior, that activity, it can be an activity. So I spoke about only smartphone. I'm talking about social media addiction, TV series addiction. There are people who are sitting at home continuously to finish off seasons of TV series. That's addiction. So if you look at almost number of cups of coffee you have, that's also addiction. So if that way looking at it, we all have a taste of addiction. Most of us. In fact, the worst part is that what Sugin is speaking about, the digital world expanding. We say digital India, we're so happy. But what's happening? We're giving these smartphones, we're actually rewiring the brains of youngsters to addictive behaviors right from the childhood. So this is how things are changing, and we are building a generation who will learn to be addicted with all these behaviors. So that's in terms of behavioral addiction. So when we talk about addiction, keep in mind we need to broaden our understanding, not use not only chemical substances, because we see when we take a substance inside, it actually creates a disturbance or makes some changes in your brain. But we need to understand the smartphone usage is also able to make a difference in our neurochemistry. So in fact, that is why we feel happy when we do this. So after a repeated time, it becomes redundant, then you lose your control over that. So then you can keep over.
Yeah, just to add to what Sham was saying, there's this Chinese proverb which says that it kind of puts together this essence of loss of control that we are talking about. The Chinese proverb goes like, first the man takes a drink, then the drink takes a drink, and then the drink takes the man. So that's the essence of how the control goes, and how that sense of acting out of a compulsive need to reach out for that substance takes control of our behaviors. That is that crucial aspect which Sham has brought out, that we are not in control of choosing. So the choice model that person is choosing to go this way, and if they want, then they can exercise their willpower to stay away from the substance, does not hold good in this entire spectrum of addiction behavior that we are talking about. Just to add to one more thing, many a times addiction comes out of this need for engaging in a thrill. So it may not always be in the sense of a habit that we're just automatically reaching out to something. It may be a conscious way of getting out of a mental state. So we may be bored, and many a times when we feel bored, or when we are feeling too overwhelmed with something, it's very normal. I've seen a lot of coworkers, I've seen a lot of clients actually going for a smoke break, because nicotine is sort of thought of as giving you that little kick when you're feeling bored, or when you want to focus on something, you want to come back and work on a very important PowerPoint. You think of that smoke break as something which will give you that kick. In fact, that's called the nicotine kick. It lasts for a few seconds, but it's not known to have a lot of cognitive element in it in terms of giving you that kick. But many a times when we want that thrill, we seek out substances, or we engage in any of these behavioral addictions as well. In fact, that's a very interesting point, that what is happening in this generation, which is so exposed to so many things that give us that thrill. There are so many things that around us. We have the internet, of course. Since the last 3 decades, we have the internet that is a constant supply of thrill, whether that's Netflix, the next series that's coming up, or the next season of your favorite series that has come up, or what's on with the news. Now we have news update every minute. You can just refresh your Google News or your app, and we are constantly seeking thrill, and it's become a part of our lives now. So we see an increase in addictive behaviors with this modern age need for thrill and something new in our lives, and not stuck with something which is boring, and something which is mundane. So that essence of thrill is also something that we see in all of these addictive behaviors. Or it can also be used to counter overwhelm. When we are feeling really overwhelmed, we usually reach out for substances, for example alcohol. Many a times when we are feeling really overwhelmed, we want to just loosen up a little bit. But the reason many people look for that weekend alcohol is because you want to loosen up and just have a chat with your friends, because throughout the week you have had to have been very high strung, because you had series of presentations, you had a meeting, you had an appraisal meeting with your boss. So you're really looking forward to the weekend to visit a pub and just loosen up. So many a times we use substances for that. And that's where the difference between the use, when the use becomes dependence, is something that we need to watch out for. So I usually, ask my clients that what we need to really do is stop, observe, and ask. So you stop yourself, you observe what's happening in your internal environment. What is your body trying to tell you? What are you feeling inside? Are you feeling any kind of sensation in your body that's really standing out for you? So what is that sensation trying to inform you? And then asking, what is it that I need right now? Is it alcohol, or is it a smoke, or is it a friend that I wish to talk to? Do I just want to connect with someone? What is it? So that ask, observe, stop, observe, and ask algorithm really sort of helps us understand, have we gone towards that spectrum of dependence? Are we automatically doing that because our minds are not able to stop and observe what is happening? It's too anxiety provoking, it's too overwhelming to even ask that. And we kind of feel that it's easier for us to just take the substance and subdue what's happening and get on with life instead of delving deeper. That's when we know that we have probably crossed that line from using the substance to letting the substance use us.
Yeah, actually, you answered my question, because this is what I was going to ask you was, when does these normalized innocuous become, when does the dependence pattern on individuals have a proclivity to become a dependency, and I think this whole reflection process, I think, would be the starting point. So what could be the underlying emotional and psychological, underpinnings that would be causing people to, not do this, the algorithm of ask, observe, ask, and what are those things that one can, dwell on? So Kanya and Shyam.
Yeah, I think one of the things, yeah, wanting to add along with what Suganya just concluded. Quite often we can see there are people who can be more prone for dependence pattern. So if you look at uh, de-addiction, or in terms of interventions for psychology, for substance dependence, is area of psychiatry or psychological medicine. Why is that it has not gone to any other field of medicine? It has gone to psychiatry or psychological medicine. We see a lot of times when we see people with substance dependence patterns, we see there is a lot of comorbidities with psychiatric conditions happening. So let me talk from an EAP essence. What is that you need to be probably aware of? So quite often we see there is something called an self-medication hypothesis. People who are prone for anxiety generally tend to help themselves by soothing themselves. Very important point what Sukanya spoke about. Quite often they might be feeling overwhelmed, they might be feeling so distressed, and they might be quite anxious. And to reduce the distress what they are experiencing, they might tend to start using substances. So in fact, this is one of the take-home messages for EAP consultants. That is, if you can be aware of, if you're able to pick up people with certain signs of psychological issues. In fact, most commonly high anxiety. So anxiety, we have a gamut of anxiety disorders, most common being social anxiety. So if you look at working in an organization, having had to deal with people around, and I spoke about we bringing in a generation who lack the ability to interact with people, what we're going to see is a lot of youngsters who do not have this ability to strike a conversation face on face, with people. So what is going to happen? They are going to help themselves to calm and relax their body by using these substances or getting involved in whatever behavioral activities which help them to calm them. So we can look for underlying psychiatric condition. Doesn't mean that always people who use substances have psychiatric problem, but we see these are comorbid conditions. So quite often comorbid conditions. So it can have a common cause. That's how the origin can be quite common. So this is one of the things which you can keep in mind. Apart from that, we can see certain times early use of substances can actually lead to psychiatric problems. So we can see people's ability to cope with, the reason why they're using the substance might be to cope with the pressures in the work. But quite often what we see is because they started substances, their ability, cognitive ability to focus on the task at hand, ability to memorize, ability to plan things also can get compromised in the long run. So most important aspect for us to do is to really pick and identify early identification of people who are probably going off track. So able to sensitize EAP consultants regarding common mental health problems. I'm sure NHRD has taken that particular aspect also, mental health disorders. So we need to be always watchful regarding that as well. Anything apart from that, Suganya?
Yes, in fact, I would like to sort of complement the view that you have brought in with something called the dislocation theory, and this was introduced between the years of 1978 and 1981 with this experiment on rats. So there was this rat park addiction study, very famous study, can be Googled out, plenty of YouTube videos and TED Talks also on it. And it has given us wonderful insights into the field of addiction. So while we look at the individual's trajectory about individual so-called risk factors in the individual that sort of increases their proclivity for substance dependence, we also need to, psychiatry also acknowledges the fact that any kind of these risk factors, which also include so-called genetic risks, are only predispositions. They are not predeterminations. So it does not guarantee that the person is going to end up in dependence. So there are certain other environmental factors that we are unfortunately exposed to, which enhances this danger of walking into the dependence pattern. So let me speak a little bit about those environmental conditions, and that sort of highlights how the environment that we are living in, our communities, our world right now, is contributing to the individual walking the path of dependence and contributing to the overall burden, global burden. So I'm going to bring to light two facts. One is the dislocation theory, which was brought about by Bruce Alexander. And with the rat park addiction study, what was seen, it was a wonderful experiment with rats. And so basically what was done was that a nice park was constructed for these rats, where the rats had a lot of things to play around with, a lot of food, a lot of friends. So, rats kind of socializing with each other. So it's like a dream world that these rats could ever imagine. I kind of imagined Stuart Little having a gala time there. So that kind of a rat park was devised, and it was found that these rats were, sort of having a lot of fun. So they were playing, they had adequate food, there was no shortage of food, and lots of nice food, lots of friends to play around with. So an excellent gala time. So even when these rats were given a morphine solution, they were not interested in it. Nothing that was done to the morphine could actually rouse their interest in taking it. Now the interesting part was when these rats, or another group of rats, were put in a cage where there were no other rats, and there was food. They weren't like kept hungry, but there were no other rats, and the environment was not so enriched, and morphine was provided. These rats, 90% of them took to the morphine. So the finding from the study actually highlights the importance of connection with our communities, with others. Our brain is actually a social organ. It needs to connect to the context that we are in. Our brains interact with our environment. If you look at videos of how neurons are sort of, connecting with each other, it literally look like little worms in your brains, which are wriggly and connecting with each other. These are not like hardwired circuits in your computers. So when we look at this social organ that we are carrying with us and which is in charge of everything that's happening in our bodies and our minds, these organs need others to survive and thrive. They need connection. When connection is absent in our environments, it's very natural for the brain to move towards substances or move towards any kind of behaviors which allows that pain to be taken care of. And that has a name in today's psychology literature. We call that psychache or psychological pain. It is very real like physical pain. It involves the same brain centers. So psychache is something that is experienced by individuals when they're not feeling connected or when they're feeling isolated. And that's something that has been found over and over again in research, that in a lot of communities, perhaps you have minority communities, or you have a lot of immigrant communities, or where you have the sense of feeling disconnected from their loved ones or from their community members, we see a lot of addiction issues to be prevalent in those communities. And that sort of just converges the finding that it is the lack of connection in our societies, in our communities, and the lack of connection with others that we are falling prey to more and more addiction issues. So that is one aspect, that with the modern world, I think most of the problems that we are facing is because of the psyche that is being brought about by this lack of connection with others. We are disconnected. We are probably more, engaged in ways to connect virtually than to actually connect in person. And of course, COVID is doing an excellent job of making us feel more and more isolated, although virtually connected, but we are losing out on the physical connect. The other part of the fact that I wanted to bring to light is how Portugal has tackled the problem of the burden of addiction. So when they started out, Portugal had a huge burden, which was similar to the rest of the world almost. But what they did was they spent a lot of resources in building communities which were supporting people who were dependent on substances. So instead of putting these individuals away in rehab homes or treatment centers, they were brought into community service. And the two-pronged approach of not only bringing them into community service, but also informing and sensitizing the communities about connecting with them is something that brought down the burden in Portugal by 50% in 5 years. And that has shown as a wonderful model for the rest of the world to work on, that we are actually investing a lot of our resources in making our criminal laws, or our the legal framework, implementing the legal framework in the context of drug control. But we are spending very little in terms of building the connection in our societies. And that might be the critical gap that we are missing out on. Many of the programs that are available in our country now, which focus on detoxification, which focus on rehabilitation, retreats, or we have a lot of these programs out of these centers which are doing wonderful work. But probably what we lack there is this sense of connecting those individuals into the communities, and by taking them away into a rehabilitation retreat, even though for a few months, does not really serve that core issue of connection. The other point is a very interesting finding by Prochaska and his colleagues, that 80% of people who are using, or in harmful use pattern or in dependence pattern of any of these substances, are not ready to take action to change, are not ready to give up. When we say ready, again, we don't mean that they're not willing to give up. They just don't feel that they're prepared to take on that war of getting out of use. However, most of the programs, in fact, 90% of the programs, cater to people who are prepared to change. So how are we actually bridging the gap? 90% of the programs are catering to the 20% of the population that's ready to change. All we need to do is show them the way to change. But how are we going out and extending help to the 80% of the population who are in the dependence pattern to get out of it? So I think we need a paradigmatic shift in terms of understanding what is addiction, and not just the role of the individual, but the role of our societies, the role of our communities, the role of the workplace in terms of how we might be stigmatizing. And the third angle that I want to bring to light is the narrative around addiction. The narrative of the addict is something that has been portrayed in our movies, in our literature, and it's something which has been romanticized as well. In a lot of movies, it's looked at as the ultimate outcome of sacrifice, or the ultimate outcome of being dedicated to a particular cause, and how it sort of proves to be a very valid narrative. Many a times, it is a narrative that is normalized. For example, we've been talking about recreational drug use, and we have been talking about how it's normal to go for a smoke break. It's absolutely fine. It's normal to go for to serve alcohol at your house when you are hosting a party or something. It's absolutely fine with that. Yet there are some narratives when we say that when someone's taking alcohol to manage their mood, there's always a question that comes up. Are you an addict? Are you an alcohol addict? So the moment we start tagging that, we're also running the risk of forcing that individual to take up the narrative. So this is another aspect that is missed out. There are social narratives to substances, especially the common substances like alcohol, tobacco, etc. And how often the sheer availability of these narratives actually run the risk of individuals, sort of latching onto it. So if I'm feeling upset, maybe the addict narrative will give me some relief. Maybe the narrative that a cigarette is going to sort of help me focus on my work, that narrative is easier to latch on to than actually do the stop, observe, ask algorithm. So sometimes it's those narratives in the workplace that could also be contributing to increasing the risk for the individual to get into the dependence pattern. So I think that's something that we need to watch out for, especially the EAP programs. If they can definitely bring this up in terms of sensitizing the workplace about the narratives that are surrounding the substance use, and how the perception of people who use substances, maybe in a harmful pattern, maybe in a dependence pattern, are we stigmatizing that? So stigmatizing, as we saw, is not going to help. Is just going to push the individual towards the disease model, make the individual feel that they are the ones who are the problems. and they need to work on their problem, and they need treatment, which is not something which is supported by the current um, literature. So those three aspects, the dislocation theory talks about how our society is rife with pain right now, isolation experiences, and the experience of psychic, and how that contributes to the brain seeking out for these substances, for getting out of that psyche. Two is the lack of resources in terms of building connections in the community, and how that's inherently making our communities more isolated than connected. And three is these narratives of drug use and addiction that exist, which become easy latch-ons for people to use in order to deal with something. I think those are important things that we need to really ask ourselves of how we might be engaging in these kind of narratives, and sort of maybe just influencing another colleague to fall for that narrative.
Yeah,
Yeah, Shyam, carry on. Please. Can you add?
going with what Sukanya was talking, very important aspect for EAP programs also in terms of connection. We as human beings, right from the birth, from the moment we are born, we immediately want to connect. Our nervous systems have the need to connect immediately. Now, what happens now? Let's take what is the take-home message for EAP programs is that if at all we are not able to provide the sense of connection at workplace, one, and if the employees are not having the sense of connection back home. I'll tell you, one of the things which usually I tell my trainees is that a person who is probably using the substance over, too much in a dependent pattern during the working hours is a clear indication that back in his family things are not fine. So EAP programs do need to look into what are those things you can do in terms of enhancing their ability to be back with the family, able to reconnect with the family, able to emotionally available for the family and give and take, able to connect back with the family. So quite often what can happen is it can be the work stress also, but if an employee is actually taking work back home, that is going to come back to the organization itself. So it is important during the stressful time they have the ability to de-stress themselves with this need of ours to connect. The need of ours to connect is emotionally and physically connect. So one of the things you can do is look at whether your programs definitely, recently I came across programs where parents are trained, organizations are training the new parents how to look after the children, because child rearing is a difficult thing to do. If a lot of those kind of things are being done, they're able to connect back to the loved ones, the children, that itself will de-stress a lot of things and they're ready to come back to work. Second thing, when you come back to work, there should be situations in the organization where they have the ability to or opportunity to connect with people. I think so. Kenya very interestingly pointed one thing. There's no point taking them once in a while for a retreat. No, that's not enough. You should be able to do that connection thing much more frequently, and it's on a day-to-day basis. If we can do that, that's very important. Second point which I want to highlight here is that the concept of motivation. What Sukanya highlighted very clearly is that none of our treatment programs, I can say none of our treatment programs, except for very few, at least in our country, we still have institutions catering to de-addiction, programs. The reason is that we actually take them without their consent, put them there, and we believe things are going to change. What is happening is it is a gap between their decision making and you advising. What happens is, so EAP programs, again, what can you do? You can just bridge the gap. If you can actually look at this as your ability to enhance their need to change, there are ways to do it. There are scientifically proven ways to enhance a person's motivation. Now, enhancing person's motivation, what we have done till date is actually creating guilt in people. We say you use substance, you're going to die, or you are not able to. So basically we create fear in people so that they get motivated. Fear is no way to motivate people. The only way to motivate people is they making the decision for change. Can we actually make people to people to make the decisions for change? We can, and there are models for it. So that is why The newer models talk about, shift in the paradigm. There's actually newer model talking about motivational approaches to, de-addiction interventions. Yes, Subhina.
Yeah,
So
Sham, so
here I'm
since you
gonna
have brought about, sorry, Geeta. So
please
since
carry on.
Sham
I'll
has
come back.
already, sure, sure. Since Sham has already brought about, this paradigmatic shift that has happened already, and it's important to understand that we're talking about a continuum of use, and this continuum of use does not have this binary concept of addiction or no addiction. It's a matter of dependence, degree of dependence. So if you're not dependent on it, you're using it, you have absolute control over the behavior, whether that's internet or whether that's any substance, you have absolute control over that behavior in terms of its use. You're fine. There's no need to categorize that individual as being vulnerable or anything, anything stark in their behavior. But the moment we feel that there is a change in the salience of the behavior, if that behavior is taking over other aspects of their lives, and also the individual is losing control over the way they are able to use that behavior. Reference point being that Chinese proverb of how the man takes the drink, and then the drink takes the drink, and then it's very similar to binge watching. So first you decide to watch a series, and then season 1 decides if you're going to watch season 2 right away, and then season 3 has taken over all your day completely. So the same concept kind of applies to substances and behavior, so it's important to watch out for that. So what's important to understand here is that since this is a continuum of behavior that we are talking about, abstinence is not the answer to addiction. Reduction is. So harm reduction is, the philosophical approach that underlies this whole concept of motivational enhancement. If we can ally with the individual and try to get a sense of what their worldview is like, if we have that interest, the compassion, the empathy to understand their world from their lens, who are we to decide for them that abstinence is the answer to all their problems? Who are we to decide that drinking alcohol to forget all the pain of their domestic issues is not the solution? We can only ally with them, try to first empathize and understand that worldview, that pain that they are going through, because we are all in pain in some form or the other. So if we can understand our pain, we can surely understand the other person's perspective of pain as well. And if we can empathize with that pain and be able to then understand what can bring them slightly towards the other end of the spectrum and not at an abstinence, that is the approach that is working wonders across the world. And that is the approach that EAP programs can take in. The harm reduction approach and the MET approach basically talks about how we need to work on bringing the individual slowly on that continuum of risk. If we can reduce the risk of dependence, we've got that. We've achieved our perspective. So the goal is to actually reduce the risk, not abstinence. So, and that is in line with a lot of our social narratives, the way we use substances. It's cool, it's okay to use substances as long as you have control over it. So that's the perspective that EAP programs need to take more into account, and also kind of sensitize, the workplace as well.
Okay, so there is a very relevant question here, which is, please explain an EAP program. And I think let's begin from there as to what the EAP program means and how does it expand to manage substance use issues at the workplace.
Sure. So EAP programs, most organizations have what is known as the employee assistance programs. And these employee assistance programs basically entails a lot of health programs, and also a lot of other things that typically we require, financial assistance, legal assistance. So it's like a 360-degree assistance of what life kind of throws at us. So the EAP programs are meant to sort of support employees through the process of their life, not just the issues that they encounter at the workplace, what Sham was referring to, that we cannot just put a blind, with a blinds on, in terms of we are just going to look at how the employee is productive at work, and we're just going to address issues which are targeting productivity of work. We also need to look at what are the issues in their life, in their personal lives, which may be impacting them, their sense of satisfaction from life. And now that we know that all of it is tied up in terms of how they are coping, and if they're not able to cope up, there is a serious risk of falling into the addiction narrative. So EAP programs, since they have that health component, they do have, most companies have signed up for counseling packages and counseling services where a consultant is there to give confidential sessions to employees, and depending on what the package is, the employees get some kind of benefits from those sessions. Some packages are completely free of cost, and they can seek benefit from those sessions. And the EAP programs also organize a lot of training sessions. So apart from the usual L&D sessions, the EAP programs also might have components of sensitizing, components of talking about mental health issues, to not only inform people about what's really happening in our minds, what are these common difficulties in the modern world that we are trying to grasp, but also trying to destigmatize these whole concepts that are plaguing our lives so much. So when we look at an EAP program, there's a lot of contact that mental health professionals and administration also has with employees, especially those who we are calling as at risk, because they are the people who are actually not being able to probably speak about the difficulties, but many of these behaviors that they are feeling compelled to act out on are actually speaking on behalf of them. These behaviors are what informs the mental health professional that there is pain behind that there is a lot of problems that at their end, which is making them feel compelled towards the addiction aspect. And I'm sure that Sham would have a lot to add to that. Sham, please go ahead.
Right. So going back to this concept of people, what is the EAP programs we can do? If all you identify these substance dependence problems and all these things there, most important thing is that we will not give advice. I think Sudhanya spoke about counseling services. I'm sure a few of the people participants might be EAP counselors already. So, or even in terms of that we should never advise a person what to do or what not to do. And in fact, what the research has found is if we advise them, the chances of they showing more resistance and they actually going up and drinking more. This research has proven that if we somebody forces them to stop a behavior, the chances of they doing that more. And there is something called as a self-determination theory. And we find that even children as young as 2 years are told what to do, they don't like it. Imagine when was the last time we ourselves heard somebody completely when we are told what to do and what not to do. So automatically what happens is in us, there is a experience of resistance which build up whenever there is somebody dominating us. So any tone of domination, it can, so definitely should not be from a counselor, because if we are a counselor, we have learned what is person-centered approach, what is to be unconditional positive regard, what is to be empathetic, to be understanding. So we never advise a person. So counseling is not advising. Same way, managers, HR managers also need to learn this skill of not advising people, rather getting it from them what exactly they want. So this is one of the things, key elements of motivational approaches, which can start right from the organization. So you might be making a referral to a de-addiction treatment, but the most important aspect is that the gap before they reach there, they should be prepared enough for it. So that motivation should be elicited from that person. That's called as evocation. You evoke the change process within the person, not you tell them, I know what is right, you do this. So the moment you have this tendency to do it, there is going to be resistance. In fact, the research has shown that if we force somebody, the chances of they doing it more is very high. And there are reasons for it. Let's say, we can't cover that here, but then there are dynamic reasons behind it. When we are opposed, the chances of we resisting is because of even our childhood experiences. Many things like that. So this is something which you can keep in mind. Anything, Sudhanya?
Yes, so when we were talking about the motivational hypothesis that we basically need to follow the what is known as the motivational stages of change, and that's something that is not just the entire model by Prochaska and DiClemente that talks about these 6 stages of change. it sort of applies for all change behaviors. So it could mean that you have been meaning to wake up at 5 a.m. in order to do some morning yoga perhaps, but you've not been able to do that. So what stage of change are you at? So it's not just pertinent for any addiction issues, but it's also pertinent for any change behaviors. So that model, when we are acquainted with that model, it also helps us understand where the other person is. Because you may have made up your mind to wake up at 5 a.m. or you may have made up your mind to reduce your intake of cigarettes. Yet you find yourself not being able to do that. So what's really happening, at the level of your determination or your motivation? So what we mean here by motivation is not willpower, but the ability to make a decision and be able to act on that decision. That part. So it's not really a matter of willpower, but really a matter of being prepared to execute that. So there are 6 stages of change, and the first stage that talks about pre-contemplation, as the word suggests, that this is the stage where we don't consider change to be important. We haven't even started thinking about change. And then, we can move to that stage of contemplation, which means that we have just started thinking about change. And what's stark here is that we have both kinds of dialogue in our head. So we have reasons for change and we have reasons not for change also. And this kind of a balance of sorts is enough to keep us there, stagnating in that stage of just thinking about it but not being able to execute the change. And then we move into the stage of preparation, where we have been able to tip off that balance. So we have decided that yes, we want to change, we want to wake up at 5 a.m. and lead a very productive life. We have been able to do that, but we don't know how to do that because we don't hear the alarm going off. So that's that stage where we are looking for strategies to work on it. I really want to do it, but I don't know how to go about it. And then the stage comes, which is known as action, where we are able to execute it. We are able to wake up at 5 a.m. We have been able to reduce our cigarette intake. We are leading very healthy lives, and it's fantastic. It's going great. But then sometimes what can happen is that something goes wrong in our lives. Maybe an appraisal meeting didn't go right, and we are back. We don't feel like waking up at 5 a.m. the next morning, and life seems to look gloomy again. So that's the stage, where we can lose out on that, and we exit that cycle and get into a lapse or a relapse. Or if we are able to maintain that, we reach maintenance, and ultimately from maintenance, we are able to establish change 3 years. Now, this stages of change model really helps us understand where individuals are. There is no right or wrong way of where you are at. It's important to realize where you are, and accordingly, your EAP professional would also make an assessment of where you are and help you move through those stages. So the idea is that it's a cyclical pattern, and that's the model is also given in your handout. So once you're able to identify which stage you're at, you also recognize, and your EAP consultant also is able to understand what do you need, because your need in each of these stages is very different. Sometimes you just need to understand, do you at all need to wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning? Do you need to reduce your cigarette intake? Sometimes you know that maybe you need to use it, but you don't know how to go about it. So your needs are very different. So EAP programs, some EAP programs have been using motivational enhancement therapy to help people move towards wellness. For example, there are organizations which have wellness programs which are based on this model of MET. But I think when it comes to addiction, we need to move the lens from looking at it as just treating it to this entire shift to MET, so that addiction is also looked at as a concept like wellness, like waking up at 5 a.m.
Yeah,
So here's a
think
very interesting question. I just wanted to I want this person to answer. He's saying we say that we don't have addiction. So the whole thing is first to deny where it's deep in our heart. You know that there is a problem, and you keep denying it because it's cool to say that it's not. It's almost like wishing it away, So how do we deal with it? So probably I hope this kind of the cycle of the stages, one would understand that everybody is, from acceptance, from denial to acceptance, and then, taking that step of motivating oneself and actually replacing that absence. So basically what we're looking at, the substance use is probably filling a gap, that absence that somebody is experiencing, whether it is a pain or it's a loss of connectivity, and then looking at options other than that substance use to be able to fill that out. And I hope, I'm not able to see the name clearly. I hope we have answered that question for you here.
I think I can add on one more concept, this concept of ambivalence. Now, what happens is, think about any decisions what you have thought of making in your own life. Don't think about your clients, or think about employees. Think about yourself. The time when you have made a decision to change, and whether you have made the change till date. Now, what can happen is it would have taken months or years together. We would have been probably contemplating about it, that particular change which you want to make for years or months together, and we are not able to make the change. That's called as ambivalence. We want to change, the same time don't want to change. So what happens is, in motivational approaches, you're able to shorten the gap. So, what is the shortest session of motivation interviewing or motivation enhancement? It can be as short as 5 minutes or 20 minutes. In single 5 minutes or 20 minutes, you're able to shift a person who is in actually contemplation to planning stage. So what can happen is, so I'm not saying every case. There are, what we're talking about dependence is much more complex. They will not actually reach a planning stage that fast. But in terms of small changes in life, that that what Sudhini spoke about, that the gap of their own motivation. So what motivation approaches can do is they fill the gap by actually enhancing their own motivation, so that they can increase the ambivalence and they are ready to make the change. Once they're ready to take the treatment, you sending them to the treatment programs will be much more enhancing. The chances of they adhering to the treatment is very high. That doesn't mean they'll not relapse. It means they can come back. The same again, we'll have to go through the same cycle.
Geeta, just to add to the question that was put up by the attendee, I think it's also important to realize that it does take a lot of strength to recognize and acknowledge our vulnerabilities. We are all vulnerable. We are all human. But at the same time, with so much of social narrative going on about being strong and being positive, and there's a total overemphasis on constantly being positive, being positive, being positive. So we kind of tend to shy away from acknowledging that we are only but human, and we all have our vulnerabilities, and addiction is one of them. We are all addicted to something or the other, and which is why I brought in that example of how many times you have fallen prey to shopping, retail therapy, as we say. That's something so common these days, although thankfully that has not reached a diagnostic category, because then many people would be sort of falling into that diagnostic category. But we all have some sort of addiction issues.
Very true. So there was one more context. What happens when organizations look at these people who are struggling, with their issues as obstacles? And how does, as organizations, as EAP professionals, as team leads, as managers, how does one actually look at the shift from looking at them as problems and obstacles to how should we look at that aspect? Who would like to take it, Sukanya or Shyam?
One of the things I'm feeling is in terms of it's a very role confusion kind of a thing. You cannot be a manager at the same time a counselor. So what can happen is we need to have probably dedicated professionals who are counselors in EAP programs who can actually take over. So basically, once you identify some kind of an issue like this, because you as a counselor, you cannot have dual roles. So the best part will be when you are actually giving these roles to dedicated people who are trained in these approaches. In fact, yes, to be properly, a system, an organization which will promote not a disease model, we actually need to promote these kind of qualities in managers also. However, they will not be able to do a deep work with the employee. The reason is that once you start talking, the chances of you probably bringing in lot many elements of the personal life which cannot take up the manager's time. That's also there. So you first place you cannot. That's what I believe. So I don't know whether Suganya agrees to what I'm talking about.
Yes, Shyam. I think what's important for managers and the managerial cadre to understand is that the entire concept of EAP also rests on the foundation of confidentiality. So we typically need that confidential, safe space to be able to talk about the difficulties that we have in life. It's very difficult to talk about our, like I said, we all feel vulnerable, but we are also trying to shield those vulnerabilities, especially in a place where we know that we are being evaluated for how productive we are. So that's why the manager employee relationship is not an ideal safe space for those kind of conversations. We need a safe context for those discussions to happen. That's not to take away the credit from managers who might have that talent for having an excellent motivator kind of role, but counseling is not about motivating. Counseling requires a safe space. So therefore the EAP space needs that kind of quality of being confidential. It's almost like a very religious space where you can create that kind of a connect. The other part I wanted to highlight, Geeta, is that we also need to have a top-down approach in terms of sensitizing the organization, the higher level administration, and then the managers as well, in terms of the paradigmatic shift that we talked about, that how are we looking at addiction, how are we looking at even mental health issues. Is there any kind of narrative in the workplace? And many times these narratives are top-down driven. So we need to look at those narratives and how they can be destigmatized. And that can only work towards enhancing the organizational climate.
I agree. How about the current COVID times? I think everything seems to have got magnified. The social isolation is so stark, and I think stress beyond, 6 months is a huge number of time, and I think the uncertainty of till when it's going to last is even more stark. So how does one look at the possibilities of this whole substance use in the current times, and how can one be a little more, proactive to look at our own colleagues and our own family members who could succumb? So what are those pointers that we should be, watchful for?
Yes, I think that's a very pertinent question in these times, and it's almost going to be a year of this anxiety that we are constantly being almost like overwhelmed with. So I'll start with sort of first defining about what is this event and how are our brains responding to this event. So this kind of a global catastrophe is actually, in our language we call it as collective trauma. So it is a traumatic experience that the entire world is going through. And any kind of collective trauma has multiple narratives going through it. So there is a global narrative of global loss, grief, so many lives being lost, so much of anxiety around it. There is also a narrative of the other, as we say, the other pandemics, the economic pandemic and the mental health pandemic as well, sort of doing the round. So there are a lot of anxiety narratives going around. What this kind of a collective trauma does is that it sort of takes away that hope of something being different, something being different in a different context. So you almost look at any country and you see similar situations happening. You look at the best democracies and the best economies in the world, everyone's going through the same kind of fear of job loss, or fear of shutdown, or even fear of any kind of salary cut, or you're just seeing that as something so very rampant. So it just makes that kind of a collective narrative very, very common. And that only enhances our anxiety. It sort of says that it can happen to anyone. If that's happening to A and B, so why can't it happen to me? So it just makes us feel all the more vulnerable. The other thing that it does is that it kind of brings our brains to process things from our past when we may have felt the same way. So it's kind of, our memory networks always encode these similar events together. So this kind of an event is also, sort of sparking off the memory of similar events from our past, which we may not have been able to make peace with yet. And so what's really happening is that we are not just experiencing the pandemic now, we are probably experiencing a cumulative effect of the pandemic and other things that have happened in our past as well, which is there in our memory. So it's a lot of trauma that our brains are dealing with. And, the most common way of the brain to deal with such an overwhelming amount of anxiety and trauma is to shut down. So what we mean by shut down is that we tend to go towards other behaviors which make us forget the current context that we are in. And that's nothing but addiction. We tend to look out for substitute behaviors, like you were saying, Geeta, that, when we are in a context where we want to just disconnect from the present, what's more available than switching to a behavior that can take us out? And that can be internet, that can be any kind of substances that have a significant impact on the nervous system and just dull it up, or sort of give us the thrill even. Or it can also be something like binge watching, or it can be something like food or retail therapy. All of these behavioral addictions as well, which helps us forget the present. It cuts off the contact with the present and gives us that temporary relief of being in a space where we don't have to deal with this overwhelming sense of panic, fear, anxiety, and trauma. And what's really happening is that over time, our brains have also, sort of coming to a point of stability where we know that, okay, this is going to persist for some time. So I need to find a way. Our brains are almost like saying that, okay, this feels like, this seems like, and, it sounds like, so it must be what I felt like that. But our brains are also processing that, oh my God, there's no end to it. So I might as well, learn to be in this state for the next few months, or I don't know till when. So none of that is really providing us relief. So COVID, in a sense, is the first unprecedented experience of its sorts for the modern generation, for the modern world, where we are going to complete a year of living in this panic and anxiety. And, we don't know how to process this. And it's especially difficult for certain individuals who might be living away from their families for job. It might be, it is difficult for all of us because we are missing, sort of having our co-workers physically with us, just meeting people or just catching up over a cup of coffee. The connection is missing. Exactly. And when we say the connection is literally physical. It's something that has a much more impact when you are face to face with someone than when you're on FaceTime with someone. So it's important to sort of, understand that yes, our brains are trying to cope up with something really, really unprecedented and difficult. And there's no one-shot solution for this. But what therapists have been finding as one way of dealing with this is to actually use whatever way is possible to connect. So if that means having more video calls, more actual FaceTime, you're able to read facial cues of your colleagues, doing that. Or probably now that things are opening up slightly in many cities, if you're able to at least visit your colleagues sometimes with all sorts of precautions in place, it's important to do that. It's important to allow our brains to physically interact with another brain in front of us. And it's normal at this time for our, for the trauma to seek out for addiction material. So it can be a substance or it can be a behavioral addiction. So if that happens, being able to reach out to helplines and being able to reach out to a mental health professional to work out how we can get our brains to recovery. Because it's not a disease, it's a reaction. It's a response of the brain to the overwhelming trauma and the threat that we are living in our times. Sham, you want to add to that perhaps?
I think I reiterate the point what Sukanya just mentioned. When I was thinking, how do we actually understand this as trauma? And then what I felt is it is the never ending. You don't know when is it going to end. Something that can become traumatic when you think that this is not going to end, and you don't know when is it going to end. That's I think most important thing. Now translating into how is it going to impact the companies. I was reading what last time pandemic did to the employers is that it increased absenteeism. It increased psychiatric illnesses in people in general, and suicide rates going up. We do not like to be locked up. So we like to move around. And what's happening, this particular lockdown pandemic is restricting us from doing whatever we used to do to feel alive in ourselves. So what is happening is, if we do not do that, even within the limited space available or restrictions, what is going to happen? We're going to break down. So definitely AP programs also need to keep in mind, you are going to see in the near future increased absenteeism at work. So this is something which need to be looked at.
And also, I think this whole thing of, they have covered it in the first session on suicide and self-harm. There are avenues that one has to be, cognitive of, that this is a possibility along with substance use. So here's a question which has come in, and I thought it would be important. Mental Health Act 2017 has included mental conditions associated with abuse and alcohol and drugs as mental illness and not just a behavioral problem. What's your take on it? As you have mentioned, that substance use should not be looked as a disease model. So here's a question for both of you to.
Yes. So traditionally, when we talk about the disease model, we talk about it only as a disease model. So we say that it is a disease and it will just go away with treatment. But the reason that it is included in the diagnostic category of, what is known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Diseases and the International Classification of Diseases, those are the gold standards for diagnosing any kind of mental health issues that we are undergoing. We need to have certain markers which can help us understand what is it that we are treating. Now, mental health disorders as such are quite puzzling, because you're not, unlike physical disorders, you don't have biochemical markers. You can't run a test and say that, oh, I have depression, and if I just take this antidepressant, so my levels of serotonin will be up and I'll be up and running. You don't have biochemical markers. We only have behavioral markers. So the only way to get diagnosed is to actually have a mental health professional, a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, look at the symptoms that you're experiencing, and only that can inform them about whether the behaviors that are the markers anyways, whether that qualifies for a particular criteria, which can say that, yes, this is a clinical syndrome, which can be anxiety disorders or which can be substance use, or it may not qualify for a diagnostic category and yet be a behavioral problem. So that applies to all mental health disorders, not just substance use. When it comes to substance use, the reason we have retained the diagnostic category is two. One is that the disease model has been around and has been the reason why the DSM started categorizing substance use disorders as a particular diagnostic category. And we do need treatment when it comes to managing withdrawal symptoms, when it comes to managing one's detoxification and all of that. We do need medical treatment. So we are not saying in any way that de-addiction is complete without the medical aspect of managing withdrawal symptoms. That's a significant aspect when we are dealing with dependence. So with harmful use, one may not be experiencing what is known as withdrawal symptoms. But with dependence, those complex issues may come up, and that's where we need treatment to manage that. So that's the second reason why it has been included there. And most important is to understand that, even if we qualify it as a psychiatric diagnosis, that we call it as a substance dependence or we call it as pathological gambling, we are not saying that it will go away only with medicines. Because even psychiatric management, management of diseases of all kinds of psychiatric disorders involve pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy. And that link between pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy has been established with research that both are required for the best recovery. So I think those are the three important things to keep in mind, why it's still retained and why it's, certain criteria are there to recognize whether it's harmful use or it's dependence. And like I said, unfortunately, we haven't been able to advance our sciences to that extent that we can have such biochemical markers for depression or substance use, whether to call it substance, harmful use or dependence. So till that time, we are going to use these behavioral markers for our diagnosis. Shyam, you would like to add to that?
To what Sukanya said, disease models came with an old theory called germ theory. Every disease has, you can identify the causative agent is a virus or a bacteria or some deformity in your body. But none of the psychiatric illness, I can say none of the psychiatric illness have a clear-cut idea that this is actually caused by this. Usually we in psychiatry, we say syndromal. We don't say it is disease. We say syndromal. So it's like a collection of symptoms. And a person who is having a, dependence, will show some other symptoms when you go to a person B. So you will not see the same kind of symptoms in the dependence people. Now, you might have 10 employees who are dependent, but you will actually see different manifestations in them. But then these are cardinal symptoms to look for, ability to control, craving, consequence of their behavior. These are things you need to keep in mind, that's all. And very important point what Sukanya spoke about, we're not actually negating pharmacological intervention. It's very important because these are also important. We spoke about the gap between reaching there. For example, the patient needs to be ready to stopping the substance. For example, when I'm dependent on a substance, let's say alcohol, they know that I need to take it. If I don't take it, it's going to cause withdrawal symptoms for me. To reduce the withdrawal symptoms might require some medications. So I might require pharmacological support to do that. So we are going to use a comprehensive model of treatment. But when it comes to EAP models, you are not directly going to involve in, you are going to refer it to a center probably who's going to take care of these things. But majorly your work will be bridging the gap, the motivation, their own need, developing their own motivation to go for the treatment.
I just want to bring to light one interesting aspect. We all are aware of these nicotine gums that are available in the market, and that essentially is nicotine replacement therapy. And I see a lot of clients and friends and a lot of people as such using these over-the-counter drugs, these nicotine gums, to sort of empower themselves to get out of tobacco use. So if they have been taking a packet of cigarettes, I have seen people reducing maybe the packet of cigarettes to half in a day, and then taking an equal amount of the nicotine gum in the day as well. So it's almost like they're taking the nicotine gum in place of the cigarettes. Whereas nicotine replacement therapy is something that needs to be taken under the guidance and the advice of psychiatrists. It is a 12-week process of getting yourself, out of that nicotine dependence. So it's not something which is supposed to go lifelong in place of your nicotine intake, in place of your cigarette smoking, or in place of your, tobacco intake. It's supposed to be a, therapy modality in which you have a limited or a controlled supply of nicotine to your bloodstream, so you don't have a lot of withdrawal symptoms as such. And at the same time, you also learn from a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist about how you can manage your cravings, the urge to take cigarettes. So a lot of these misconceptions exist because we also somehow misconstrue treatment with just medicines. So it is not just medicines that actually helps, which is why I refrain from using the word treatment. I prefer to use the word recovery, because we are not just going to use medicines for this purpose. We need medicines and therapy or counseling, however we may choose to call it.
So someone has put in a technical question. Does the EAP consultant have to be a clinical professional or just an ambassador ally can play that role?
As far as my knowledge goes, EAP programs need to take in, at least from the psychologist, consultant who's a psychologist, they need to have at least an MA in clinical psychology to be able to, or an MA in counseling psychology, in order to be able to at least have those conversations that we talked about, right? That in a safe space, be able to create that safe space, be able to understand clinical issues. But typically, from my experience of EAP programs, most of these programs also have a hierarchy of sorts, where there are more qualified, more experienced mental health professionals, maybe a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist also in the team, who guide the process, ensuring full confidentiality of the client, who also guide the process, because not having enough of clinical skills and training can be dangerous in terms of identifying any kind of mental health issues and dealing with them, because like Sham has been pointing out, that how we need to be trained in MET approaches and other important clinical approaches. We need to have those clinical skills as well to be able to recognize and pick up signs of self-harm, for example. So it's not enough to be just an ambassador, according to my knowledge, or in the best interest of people with issues so stark as addiction and even self-harm. We need to have experienced professionals in the EAP program.
Okay. I think that has been a wonderfully eye-opening and insightful session today. We are almost at the end, 2 minutes to go. And frankly, I'm going back with a huge load of understanding, and there's so many deeper layers to substance use. And very rightly, as you all, both of you pointed out, the sensitization and awareness is very, very critical, whether it is in our own families or at the workplace. And I'm sure the audience has a lot more to reflect upon. And well, for the organization, there's a lot of work seems to be cut out for the way forward. I think there is a huge need for us to expand our lens, again, from the disease model to look at it as a, harm reducing model. It is an amazing perspective, looking at it from the pain aspect, why the pain, I think what you mentioned, rather than why the addiction. And I think overall, a societal, let's say, rebooting is called for. Any last statements that Sukanya and Shyam, would you like to make before we conclude to our session today?
I think a very important aspect is that we, with a lot of new researchers coming in, EP programs need to really look into policy changes, adapting, newer policies to include these kind of, awareness or scientific understanding to their programs, which will actually enhance the, better results or give us better results. Right? And one most important thing what Sukanya spoke about, need for training for the staff, because what I feel is you'll only see what you believe or what you know in your mind. It's very important you trained in those aspects to actually start seeing and able to help people.
Yes, I think reboot is the right word, like you mentioned, not just in terms of the workplace, but also in terms of the societal lens. And that shift in lens in terms of not asking why the addiction, but why the pain, that is critical.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, NHRDN, to have kicked off such an amazing week, and we hope this snowballs into something which is long-term sustainable. And thank you, Nisha, and thank you so much, Sukanya and Shyam, for being with us today. And thank you, audience. We've had some very insightful questions, and I think it got a lot of clarity for a lot of us. So over to you, Nisha.
Thank you. Thank you indeed, ma'am. I must say, most of the questions that were posed by the participants have been addressed. Such a beautifully orchestrated discussion and conversation between Sukanya and Shyam. So grateful thanks to you, Dr. Geeta Kumar. Before we conclude, I will take less than a minute to quickly talk about what to expect later in the day. We have this session on the Zoom platform on best practices in the mental wellness space in organizations. Do join to hear from the expert panel. And quick recap of this calendar. Do register. We have shared the link in the chat section. And also do ensure that you join hands with us, become a member at NHRDN, visit our website, which is nationalhrd.org, and do tag us on social media. Our handle and the hashtag is mentioned here. Do ensure that you fill up the feedback. It's very vital that we hear from you in terms of how you find our offerings. Thank you indeed. Stay safe, and we look forward to your continued participation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.